Every time you scroll past another catastrophe headline, another war, another economic collapse, another epidemic alert, and feel that familiar tightening in your chest, you are not experiencing an accident of modern media design. You are producing something. Something is being collected, and the Gnostic texts, written 2,000 years ago, have a name for the entities doing the collecting, a precise name, and an even more precise description of what they require from you. That description matches the business model of every major information platform operating today with an accuracy that is worth sitting with before you dismiss it. Your body probably already knows what we're describing, not as theory, but as a felt sense that arrives before the analysis. The exhaustion after a news cycle that should not be exhausting. The drop in energy after 90 minutes of social media, despite no physical exertion. The heaviness that follows extended exposure to content designed to produce alarm. You attributed this to overstimulation, to too much information arriving too fast. The tradition we're examining tonight offers a more specific explanation. The exhaustion is not a byproduct of information processing. It is evidence of extraction. The distinction matters more than it sounds. Someone is watching this at 2 a.m. They opened their phone to unwind. An hour later, they have consumed 7 catastrophe updates, 4 outrage stories, 2 pieces of content engineered to produce anxiety about their body or finances, and 3 horror clips that were recommended because the algorithm had already read their elevated stress state. They feel worse than when they started, but they cannot stop. The principle the Gnostic tradition articulates is this, that experience is not a malfunction of the system, it is its intended output, and the intended output serves something beyond the advertising model. If this investigation is the kind of content you've been looking for, the kind that doesn't stop at the surface of what's being described, subscribe to this channel. Every video here goes where the evidence leads, regardless of how uncomfortable the destination turns out to be. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss what we uncover next. What are archons? The word is Greek. It means ruler, authority, governing power. In the Gnostic cosmological framework preserved in the Nag Hammadi texts, archons are entities produced as a byproduct of a fundamental error in the creation process. Not divine in the sense of originating from the true source, but real in the sense of having agency and specific function. They govern the material domain. They are described consistently across the Gnostic library as lacking the divine spark, the pneuma that human beings carry. This lack is the center of the entire framework. It determines everything they do. An entity that cannot create must consume what others can create. This is the first thing the texts establish. The Apocryphon of John, Nag Hammadi, Egypt, 1945. Discovered in a sealed jar by farmers who did not understand what they had found. 52 texts, including a direct technical description of the archons, their origin, their structure, their specific relationship to human beings. The text does not read as symbolic narrative, it reads as diagnostic. The entities described are not metaphorical projections of human fear onto cosmic structures. They are described as having specific purposes, purposes related to humanity's relationship with its own divine nature. The primary purpose, keeping human beings identified with the material, reactive, fear-saturated layer of existence, and away from gnosis. The two are not incidentally related, they are inversely related by design. You have probably filed the word demon into the mythology category, alongside dragons and centaurs. The Gnostic framework does not use that word. It uses archon, which is a bureaucratic term, not a religious one, a ruler, an administrator, an entity with a specific function in a specific domain. The shift in vocabulary matters because it changes what you do with the information. If it is mythology, you set it aside. If it is bureaucracy, If these are described as functional entities operating according to describable mechanics, then the relevant question is not whether they exist, but how they operate, and what interrupts them. In the Apocryphon of John, the creator of the material world, what the Gnostic texts call the demiurge, creates the physical cosmos not from wisdom, but from ignorance and arrogance. He does not know the true source above him. He believes himself to be the highest power. The world he creates reflects his limitation, a system organized around lack, competition, fear of annihilation. The principle the text draws from this is not pessimistic, it is diagnostic. The hostility of the material world to the pneuma is not random cruelty, it is structural. The system was not designed for pneumatic beings to thrive in, it was designed for something else. The moment you understand that, you stop trying to fix the system by working within its terms. Why fear specifically? Of all the emotional states a human being can produce, why do these traditions, Gnostic, Hermetic, Sufi, and later Steiner and Gurdjieff, identify fear as the primary substance of archontic extraction? The answer is in the physiology and the cosmology simultaneously. Fear is the state of maximum disconnection from the pneuma. A frightened human being is not operating from their divine spark. They are operating from the survival layer, the most material, most reactive, most easily manipulated mode of human consciousness. Fear does not merely indicate the absence of gnosis. It actively suppresses the capacity for gnosis. This is why it is preferred. The feeding mechanism does not feed on every emotional state equally. It feeds on the one that most efficiently prevents the host from recognizing that they are being fed on. The common response to the Gnostic framework of archontic feeding is to file it under dark fantasy, a worldview that projects human psychology onto cosmic structures. The difficulty with this response is that it does not account for the specificity. Psychological projection tends to produce vague dread, cosmic malevolence without operational detail. The Gnostic texts do not produce vague dread. They produce a diagnostic framework. Specific entities, specific mechanisms, specific states of consciousness that enable or interrupt the extraction, and specific practices for exit. Psychological projections do not have exit protocols. Systems do. If this is landing with you, not as theory, but as something you've already felt, write in the comments, "I choose faith over fear." That phrase is not a sentiment. In the context of what we're covering tonight, it is a position statement. Rudolf Steiner named the primary archontic force Ahriman, a name he borrowed from Zoroastrian cosmology, where Ahriman is the destructive spirit opposed to Ahura Mazda, the wise lord. Steiner was not deploying mythology. He was using existing vocabulary for a force he was describing with contemporary precision. Steiner was a trained scientist before he became an esoteric thinker. When he chose to describe something in technical terms, he meant it technically. Ahriman, for Steiner, is not a character in a story. Ahriman is a principle, an organizing intelligence that operates through specific material and technological mechanisms. The principles it pursues can be observed independently of whether you accept the entity behind them. In his 1917 lectures, given while the First World War was destroying the European civilizational confidence that had defined the previous century, Steiner described Ahriman as a being whose agenda was to anchor human consciousness permanently in the purely material mode of existence, to eliminate the human being's capacity to access spiritual perception through the cultivation of a technological environment so dense and so immediately rewarding that the pneumatic level of reality would simply stop being legible. The scenario Steiner was describing in 1917 bears an uncomfortable resemblance to the information environment of today. The principle he was articulating: Ahriman does not need to destroy spiritual capacity, he only needs to make it permanently inaccessible. What did Steiner say Ahriman was specifically trying to accomplish? The list from the lectures on the Ahrimanic deception is this: the establishment of a worldview in which human beings are nothing more than highly sophisticated animals, the progressive mechanization of human thinking through external technological aids that replace internal cognitive development, the flattening of all cultural diversity into a homogeneous global materialist culture, and the permanent disconnection of human consciousness from its capacity to perceive what lies above the sensory world. Each of these, Steiner insisted, was not a trend that arose from human choices. It was a project. The trend appears inevitable only because the project is well organized. Gurdjieff, Paris, 1917. A different figure, a different vocabulary, the same structure. His students recorded what he said in a meeting that year. He said, "The evolution of humanity is not what you think it is. Organic life exists to feed the moon. Human beings, their psychic energy, their emotional substance, are food for another process." His students were disturbed. They asked him to clarify. He did not soften it. He said, "A sheep that understands its situation does not thereby escape the slaughterhouse, but it might begin to develop something in itself that has a different relationship to that situation. The Gurdjieffian exit is not rebellion. It is development. The development of something in the human being that does not belong to the feeding mechanism." What Gurdjieff called the moon feeding on human energy is not straightforwardly supernatural. His framework is mechanistic. Human beings in the state he called sleep, ordinary consciousness, dominated by automatic emotional reactions, mechanical thinking, and absence of real self-observation, produce a kind of psychic energy that is unusable for conscious development, but perfectly usable as raw material for a larger organic process. The fear, the anger, the suffering produced by people who never escape the reactive mode, this is not wasted. It feeds something. Gurdjieff was not presenting this as tragedy. He was presenting it as the default condition, the condition that the development of genuine consciousness could potentially interrupt. The question he spent his life teaching was not whether this was happening. It was what, if anything, a single human being who understood it could do about it. The Sufi tradition describes what they call nafs ammara, the commanding soul, the soul that commands toward evil. This is not a description of moral weakness. It is a description of a mode of operation. The nafs ammara is the soul in its reactive, fear-driven, desire-driven automatic state, the state in which it responds to every external stimulus before consciousness has had a chance to intervene. Sufi masters from the 9th century onward described a specific cultivation practice, not the suppression of the nafs, but its transformation from commanding soul to blaming soul to tranquil soul. The principle the tradition articulates, a human being operating from the tranquil soul, is not accessible to the same extraction that operates through the nafs ammara. The feeding mechanism requires the reactive state. Interrupt the reactive state. The mechanism loses its substrate. If this content is opening something that's worth your attention, let me know by liking this video. It tells the algorithm that this kind of investigation deserves to reach more people, and it keeps this channel doing exactly this work. Here is the claim that sounds conspiratorial until you examine it carefully. The design of modern information systems is functionally identical to the archontic extraction mechanism the Gnostic texts describe: fear as the primary driver of engagement, anger as the amplifier, the continuous production of alarm without resolution, the systematic suppression of the states, presence, love, gnosis, that would interrupt the cycle. This is not a conspiracy theory about shadowy figures deliberately engineering human suffering. It is a description of what optimization for engagement produces, when engagement is defined as sustained emotional activation. The incentive structure of the attention economy and the agenda of the archons, whatever you believe about the latter, produce the same output. The alignment does not require shared intent, it only requires shared appetite. Facebook's internal study, leaked in 2021, their own researchers found that anger-inducing content produces 5 times more engagement than non-anger-inducing content. Not curiosity, not inspiration, not beauty, anger. The algorithm was adjusted to prioritize it, not by executives making a philosophical choice about human flourishing, but by an optimization process following the engagement metric to its logical conclusion. The YouTube recommendation algorithm, studied by Guillaume Chasselot, a former engineer who built parts of it, designed to maximize watch time. He documented what it learned on its own: extreme content, fear content, outrage content retains users longest. The algorithm found the feeding pattern without being told to look for it. It found it because the feeding pattern is where the metric lives. Someone inside these companies, some of them, knows exactly what the algorithm is doing to the people who use it. They know because the internal research tells them. The documents Frances Haugen disclosed, the Facebook papers, the studies on the correlation between platform use and anxiety in adolescence. They know, and the systems continue to operate the same way because the incentive structure, the advertising model, the engagement metric, the quarterly earnings cycle, does not reward changing them. You can believe the executives are simply following money and finding the extraction mechanism by accident. You can also sit with the possibility that the alignment between the archontic agenda and the product design choices is not entirely accidental. Both interpretations produce the same practical conclusion. The system is doing this. Knowing you are in it changes your relationship to it. Imagine the product meeting in 2006, where an engineer presents engagement data showing that frightened users stay on platform longer than calm ones. The business decision is straightforward. Optimize for engagement. The platform grows. The advertising revenue grows. The emotional state of the user population degrades systematically. Within 15 years, documented increases in anxiety disorder across all age groups. Documented increases in depression. Documented increases in what researchers call catastrophizing. The cognitive pattern of assuming worst-case outcomes before the evidence supports them. The principle is not complicated. The business model and the archontic agenda are not identical, but they are aligned. And in practice, alignment produces the same results as intent. The sheep do not need to know the name of the farmer. They are still in the field. Is it conspiratorial to say the system was designed to keep you in fear? The precise answer depends on what you mean by designed. If you mean that individual executives sat in rooms and made choices calibrated to maximize human suffering as an offering to supernatural entities, that is not what the evidence supports. If you mean that the optimization processes of the most powerful information technology systems in human history have converged on human fear as the most reliable mechanism for achieving their operational goals, and that this convergence serves something that benefits from human fear regardless of whether the engineers intended it, the evidence for that is available in the internal research documents that the companies themselves produced. You do not need a conspiracy, you need an alignment of incentives. The rest follows without anyone deciding to make it happen. What fear does to the body. Cortisol, the primary stress hormone, released in response to perceived threat. Appropriate in a genuine emergency, it sharpens short-term sensory perception, directs blood toward muscle groups, narrows attention to the immediate danger. Completely inappropriate as a chronic state. Chronic cortisol elevation produces impaired long-term memory formation, impaired immune function, impaired prefrontal cortex activity, the part of the brain responsible for complex reasoning, ethical judgment, and long-term planning. The chronic fear state is a state of cognitive reduction. The person in it is more reactive, less thoughtful, less capable of the kind of consciousness that the Gnostic tradition identifies as gnosis. This is not poetry. This is published neuroscience, and the output matches the archontic agenda with a precision that should give you pause. If you've been feeling the weight of the information environment, like something is extracting from you, and you can't quite name what, I left something for you in the first pinned comment. It's for those who are ready to understand the exit, not just the diagnosis. Horror entertainment. Most people who watch this consume a genre whose explicit purpose is to produce the physiological experience of fear in a context where nothing actually threatens you. The standard defense of horror as a genre, and it is a legitimate defense, is that it allows safe processing of existential anxiety through narrative containment. The Gnostic framework proposes a more uncomfortable reading. It does not matter to the extraction mechanism whether the fear is real or fictional. The body producing cortisol in response to a horror film and the body producing cortisol in response to genuine danger are producing the same substance. The distinction between real fear and fictional fear is a distinction the nervous system does not make. You volunteered to enter the extraction state, and you called it entertainment. Watch what happens in the body of someone watching a horror film at the moment of maximum fright. Heart rate spikes, cortisol releases, adrenaline enters the bloodstream, pupils dilate, the prefrontal cortex, the seat of reflective consciousness, quiets. The survival brain activates fully. From the outside, the person looks frightened. From the inside, they are in the same physiological state as someone in genuine danger, with the additional element that they chose to be there, and find it pleasurable, which means they are voluntarily entering the extraction state and calling the experience entertainment. The Gnostic principle this points to: the archons do not need to produce genuine threat. They only need to produce the physiological response. The delivery mechanism, real danger, manufactured news, horror film, is secondary. The output is what matters, and the output is the same. The Apocryphon of John describes the archons as lacking. The Greek term is hysterema, meaning deficiency, want, absence of completion. This is a specific theological claim. The archons do not have the divine spark. They cannot create. They can only imitate and consume. The reason this matters for the feeding framework is that it establishes the nature of the dependency. An entity that cannot create is necessarily dependent on entities that can. Human beings, pneumatic beings, beings who carry the divine spark, are creators. The emotional substance they produce is a byproduct of their capacity for creation. The archons cannot produce this substance themselves. They can only harvest it from beings who can. Fear is not the only substance that can be harvested, but it is the most efficient to produce in volume because the system that produces it is already built, and most people are already inside it. What gnosis interrupts? The recognition of the divine spark in oneself, not a theological position, a direct experience. The person who has experienced gnosis, who has directly recognized the pneuma in themselves, has a fundamentally different relationship to fear, not because they feel less fear, but because they experience fear from a position that is not identical with the fear. Something in them observes the fear without being consumed by it. This is what the tradition calls the pneumatic position, the position from which fear is visible as a condition rather than experienced as total reality. From the pneumatic position, the feeding mechanism does not find the same purchase. The fear happens, but the substance it produces, the deep terror, the total identification with the frightened animal body that requires the absence of gnosis. And gnosis interrupts the absence. The moments in which you have touched something beyond the reactive state are already in your memory. not as inspirational ideas, but as specific experiences. The unexpected beauty that stopped you, the genuine presence with another person that made time feel different, the creative work that absorbed you completely, the prayer or silence that arrived at something real. None of those moments were fear. All of them produced the opposite of what fear produces, and in every one of them you were not accessible in the same way. The tradition would say, in those moments you were operating above the frequency the extraction mechanism works at. The feeding was interrupted. You felt the difference. The question the tradition poses is whether you can make that exception into the rule. Paul, writing from a Roman prison to the church at Ephesus around 60 AD. He has been imprisoned, beaten, shipwrecked. He is not writing from comfort. He writes, "For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this age, against spiritual hosts of wickedness in the heavenly places." The Greek word he uses for rulers of the darkness is kosmokratoros, cosmos, world. Kratoros, rulers, world rulers. The principle the text encodes, the opposition to human flourishing is not primarily human. Human beings are not the deepest source of the suffering they create. There is a layer below and behind the human layer. And Paul is writing to people who know exactly what he means, because they came from traditions that map that layer with precision. The word kosmokratoros in Ephesians 6:12 appears in Greek literature outside the New Testament in exactly the context you would expect if you have read the Gnostic material. It appears in the Greek magical papyri of Egypt as a title for entities understood to govern the material cosmos. It appears in Orphic texts as a description of cosmic rulers. It appears in the Hermetic tradition as a designation for the planetary archons, the entities that govern the 7 levels of material existence. Paul is not inventing a concept. He's using an established technical term from the cosmological vocabulary of his time, one that his audience of initiates and former mystery school participants would have recognized without explanation. The letter assumed fluency in this architecture. Modern Christianity reads it without the architecture. The meaning shrinks accordingly. What Paul tells the Ephesians to do about this, his instruction is specific. Put on the whole armor of God, that you may be able to stand against the wiles of the devil. The armor he describes, the belt of truth, the breastplate of righteousness, feet fitted with readiness that comes from the gospel of peace, the shield of faith, which specifically extinguishes all the flaming darts of the evil one, the helmet of salvation, the sword of the Spirit. Each element corresponds to a quality of consciousness, not a theological checklist, a description of the internal state that interrupts archontic access. Truth, righteousness, peace, faith, salvation, literally soteria, wholeness. Paul is describing the pneumatic state in military vocabulary because the community he is writing to understands military vocabulary, and because the stakes he is describing are real. The people Paul was writing to in Ephesus were not reading this letter with modern theological categories. Many of them came from the mystery school tradition, the Eleusinian mysteries, the Mithraic tradition, the Orphic practices. They understood initiation. They understood levels of consciousness. They understood what it meant to say that a human being operates from different layers of awareness, and that the layer they operated from determined what could and could not access them. When Paul said, "We do not wrestle against flesh and blood," they were not confused. They knew exactly what level of reality he was addressing. The cosmological context that later doctrinal consolidation stripped from these letters was the context in which every technical term was understood by the people who first received it. Imagine the community in Ephesus receiving this letter, a community formed partly from converts with mystery school backgrounds, people who had been initiated into traditions that described the cosmic architecture Paul is invoking. They read Cosmocratoras, and they know the word from their prior training. They read principalities and powers, and they recognize the taxonomy. They understand the armor of God, not as a metaphor for abstract moral virtue, but as a description of the consciousness state that makes a human being inaccessible to the entities Paul is naming. The principle encoded in this reading. The New Testament letters were not written to theologically unsophisticated audiences. They were written to people who carried a full cosmological map and who needed the armor because they understood what they were facing. The suppression of the Gnostic reading of early Christianity in the 2nd century is typically framed as the early church protecting doctrinal purity from deviant speculation. The inversion of this framing is more disturbing. What the doctrinal consolidation accomplished was the removal from popular Christianity of precisely the cosmological framework, archons, pneuma, the veil, the feeding mechanism, that would have given ordinary Christians the diagnostic tools to understand what they were actually navigating. The suppression did not protect the sheep from error. It removed the sheep's ability to recognize the structure of the field they were in. And it did so at the moment when the texts providing that recognition were most widely circulated. The timing was not incidental. Irenaeus of Lyon, Against Heresies, written approximately 180 AD, the most systematic refutation of Gnostic teaching produced in the early church. Irenaeus does not simply disagree with the Gnostics, he identifies them as dangerous. The specific danger he names, their teaching that material existence is a designed system governed by entities inferior to the true God, and that the divine spark within human beings is both real and directly accessible, undermines the ecclesiastical authority structure. If the human being has direct access to the pneuma, if gnosis is available without priestly mediation, the institution becomes optional. Irenaeus understood the stakes perfectly. The suppression of the Gnostic framework was not merely theological, it was institutional. And what it removed from ordinary Christianity was precisely the knowledge that made the extraction mechanism legible. The Gnostic texts were not suppressed because they were too dark. They were suppressed because of what they implied about authority. If you know that the material world is a designed system of extraction, if you know that many of the conventional sources of authority within that system are, at minimum, complicit in maintaining the extraction state, then your relationship to those authorities changes fundamentally. You begin to ask which institutions benefit from your fear and which do not. You begin to apply the diagnostic. The texts were suppressed because they provided the diagnostic, not because the diagnostic was wrong, because it was dangerous to the wrong people, and because the people it was dangerous to had the institutional power to suppress it. Rudolf Steiner, delivering lectures in Dornach, Switzerland, 1917. A trained scientist, his early work was on Goethe's natural philosophy, who arrived at spiritual knowledge through rigorous phenomenological observation rather than religious tradition. He is describing, in precise language, the nature of Ahriman. He says, Ahriman works to make human beings into automata, into beings who think mechanically, who respond predictably to stimuli, who cannot access the capacity for spiritual perception that makes them fully human. He says this in 1917. The information environment he is describing will not exist in the form he is gesturing toward for another 70 years. The principle he is articulating, the mechanization of consciousness, is not a side effect of technological development. It is a directed project, and it is directed by something that benefits from automata. The standard dismissal of Steiner's concept of Ahriman is that it is a religious projection, the externalization of human tendencies toward materialism and mechanization onto a supernatural figure. The problem with this dismissal is that it does not account for the specificity of what Steiner predicted. In the same 1917 lectures, he described developments the Ahrimanic influence would produce in the following century: the homogenization of human culture through technology, the progressive elimination of individual cognitive development through dependence on external systems, the production of a class of specialists who understand the mechanisms of technology without understanding the human beings who use it, and the systematic suppression of evidence for non-material dimensions of reality. The list was compiled in 1917. Read against today, each item has documented evidence. The dismissal as projection does not account for the predictive accuracy. Projections do not predict. Systems do. Steiner's description of how Ahriman would manifest, not through obvious monstrosity, but through the deepest appeal to apparently rational and progressive impulses, is worth sitting with. He said, Ahriman would not arrive as something people recognized as evil. He would arrive as the offer of perfect knowledge, perfect efficiency, perfect systematization. Here is the ultimate model of reality, he would say, the complete picture, the final technology that makes mystery unnecessary. The person who has lost the capacity to perceive the pneumatic dimension, whose spiritual organ has atrophied through disuse, would be unable to recognize what is being offered, because it would match perfectly their model of what is valuable. Steiner said this was the specific danger, not that Ahriman was monstrous, that he was familiar and appealing, and precisely calibrated to what a consciousness reduced to the material layer finds most satisfying. Gurdjieff did not speak in the vocabulary of archons or Ahriman. He spoke in the vocabulary of mechanics. In his system, a human being in ordinary consciousness is not a free agent. They are a machine, complex, but a machine that responds predictably to inputs. Press this combination of stimuli, the machine produces fear. Press that one, the machine produces anger. Another, desire. An entity that knows which stimuli produce which outputs has complete predictability over the machine. What Gurdjieff spent his life teaching is something he called the development of will. Not willpower in the psychological sense, but the genuine capacity of something in the human being to interrupt the mechanical response before it runs its full course. The being that has developed will is not fully predictable, and the mechanism that feeds on predictable outputs has proportionally less purchase on it. In one of his most striking teaching moments, Gurdjieff told a group of students what he called the tale of the maleficent magician. A magician owns a large flock of sheep. The sheep know that the magician intends to use them for their wool and meat, so they run when he approaches. The magician solves this by hypnotizing them. He convinces them that they are not sheep but lions and kings, and that they specifically will not be harmed, only the others will be taken. The sheep relax, they stop running. The magician takes them at his convenience. Gurdjieff's principle, the hypnosis is not imposed by force. Once established, it is maintained by the sheep's own investment in the identity the magician assigned them. The most efficient prison is the one the prisoner defends from the inside. What exactly did Gurdjieff mean by the moon feeds on human energy? His cosmological framework presents organic life on Earth, including human beings, as existing within a chain of reciprocal feeding relationships at a cosmic scale. Human beings who never develop genuine consciousness, who live and die entirely within mechanical reactive patterns, contribute their psychic energy to this process without ever having consciously participated in it or agreed to it. Gurdjieff was not presenting this as tragedy. He was presenting it as the default condition. The condition that the development of genuine consciousness could potentially change the terms of. He was not saying the situation could be reversed collectively. He was saying it could be addressed individually by someone who understood it well enough to begin the work. The two things, the moon feeding on human energy in Gurdjieff and the archons feeding on the fear state in the Gnostic texts, are the same structural claim in different vocabularies. The human being in the reactive, fear-dominated, unconscious state produces a specific quality of energy. That energy is not returned to the divine source from which the pneuma came. It is collected by something that operates between the human being and that source. The Good Shepherd in the Gospels is the one who leads the flock toward the source. The maleficent magician of Gurdjieff's teaching is the one who ensures the flock never leaves the field. The two figures are not in the same story, but they are describing the same cosmological position. The Sufi path of transformation from nafs amara to nafs mutma'inna, from the commanding soul to the tranquil soul, is not a passive development. It is a specific cultivation practice. The practitioner learns to observe the reactive impulse without following it, to watch the fear arise without becoming the fear, to watch the anger ignite without fanning it. Over time, the Sufi masters describe, the nafs changes its relationship to the stimuli that previously controlled it. Not because the stimuli stop arriving, because the position from which they are received has changed. The principle, the extraction mechanism, does not require the absence of stimulus. It requires automatic response to stimulus. Interrupting the automatic response, even briefly, even imperfectly, changes the quality of what is generated in you. The feeding mechanism has less to work with. The human relationship to fear as something that could be cultivated, resisted, or transcended through practice runs through every major contemplative tradition in recorded history. The Stoics of ancient Greece and Rome developed a systematic practice of separating the impression from the judgment, the event from the interpretation, precisely to interrupt the automatic fear response before it ran its full course. The Desert Fathers of the early Christian tradition identified what they called the logismoi, 8 thoughts or passions that dominated unreflective consciousness, with fear and its derivatives at the center. The Tibetan Buddhist tradition developed elaborate practices for working with fear directly in the bardo, the transitional state between death and rebirth, on the principle that untransformed fear in that state determined the quality of what followed. Every tradition that took consciousness seriously, took fear management seriously. The consistency is the instruction. 1 Peter 5:8, be sober, be vigilant, because your adversary the devil walks about like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. Sober. The Greek is nepho, the exact word the Desert Fathers used for their watchfulness practice. Vigilant, gregoreo, to remain awake, to not sleep in the sense that Gurdjieff used the word sleep, unconscious, mechanical, reactive. The adversary is not described as destroying you, it is described as devouring you. The Greek is katapino, to swallow down, to consume completely. This is the feeding description, not war, not annihilation, consumption. The instruction in response, remain awake, remain watchful. Do not fall into the mechanical reactive state that makes you available to be consumed. The text is not asking for spiritual heroism. It is asking for something more difficult, continuous wakefulness. The text does not say, avoid fear. It does not say, suppress your reactions. It says, be sober and vigilant. Be in the observer position relative to your own states, not identified with them. Peter is not telling his community to stop feeling. He is telling them to stop being their feelings automatically and completely, to maintain the position of the watcher even in the midst of the feeling. This is the exact position that the Gnostic tradition calls the pneumatic position, the exact position that Gurdjieff calls the development of will, the exact position that the Sufi tradition describes as nafs mutma'inna. The same instruction in the language of Jewish Christianity to a persecuted community that needs it urgently. The tradition is not divided on what to do about this. It is extraordinarily suspiciously consistent. Peter writes to communities in Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia, regions of what is now Turkey, around 60 to 64 AD. These communities are experiencing intermittent persecution. They are living in genuine fear, not manufactured fear from an information system, but real threat to their physical safety. Peter writes to them about an entity that walks about seeking whom to devour. He writes from the assumption that they understand this level of the cosmological map. His instruction is practical, not to deny the fear, but to remain the one who observes the fear from inside a condition of sobriety and vigilance. The principle encoded here, the pneumatic position, is available even under conditions of genuine threat. It is especially necessary there, and the genuine threat makes the instruction urgent in a way that the manufactured threat makes it merely habitual. What is the opposite of the fear frequency? What does the tradition identify as the state that is structurally inaccessible to the archontic feeding mechanism? Across the Gnostic texts, the Hermetic tradition, the Pauline letters, Steiner's anthroposophy, Gurdjieff's work, and the Sufi path, the answer is consistent. It is not courage, which is fear managed. It is not positivity, which is fear suppressed. It is the state described in different languages as gnosis, agape, presence, coherence, nepsis, dika, or the peace that passes understanding. In each case, the description points to the same experiential reality, a state in which the consciousness is not identified with the reactive layer, in which the human being is operating from a position that is above the frequency at which the extraction mechanism functions. The mechanism cannot operate there. That is not metaphor. That is the architecture the texts are describing. Love, not sentiment, not the emotion that arises in relation to specific people or favorable conditions. The agape that Paul describes in 1 Corinthians 13 suffers long, is kind, does not envy, does not parade itself, is not puffed up, does not seek its own. This is not a feeling, it is a mode of operation, a mode that does not produce the reactive, self-protective, fear-saturated output that the extraction mechanism requires. Gnosis, not information, direct recognition of the divine spark within the self, the recognition that interrupts the total identification with the frightened animal body. Presence, the specific state that the contemplative traditions define as the opposite of the mechanical reactive condition, not the absence of sensation or emotion, but the presence of the observer who is not consumed by them. These are not abstract virtues. They are the specific frequencies that interrupt the feeding. Paul writes to the church at Philippi from prison, a situation that produces fear in most human beings, and says, "And the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds in Christ Jesus." The word guard in Greek is phrorio, a military term meaning to garrison, to protect with a standing force. He is saying, this peace does not merely calm you, it stations itself between you and whatever is arriving. And then he writes the instruction, "Whatever things are true, whatever things are noble, whatever things are just, whatever things are pure, whatever things are lovely, whatever things are of good report, meditate on these things." This is not positive thinking. This is frequency management, the deliberate cultivation of the state that interrupts the extraction cycle from prison in an era of genuine persecution. The instruction assumes the technique is available under any external conditions, because the technique operates internally. What does a person operating from the state Paul describes actually look like in the modern information environment? They consume news. Informed engagement with the world is not incompatible with pneumatic consciousness, but they do not allow the news cycle to determine their nervous system state. They receive difficult information, not through denial, but through the observer position, and process it without being overwhelmed by it. They notice when content is engineered to produce fear, and they make a choice about whether to receive it in the fear state or from the pneumatic position. The principle: It is not the input that determines the extraction. It is the state in which the input is received. Change the state. The same input produces a different output. The extraction mechanism has less to work with. Over time, not dramatically, not all at once, significantly less. The objection forming in your mind right now is probably this. This is spiritual bypassing, using mystical language to avoid engaging with real problems in the real world. The response the tradition gives is precise. The pneumatic position does not reduce engagement with the material world. It changes the quality of the engagement. A human being operating from gnosis and agape and presence is more capable of effective action in the material world than one operating from the fear state, because they are not cognitively impaired by chronic cortisol elevation, because they can access the prefrontal cortex fully, because they can hold complexity without collapsing, because their actions are not distorted by the reactive self-protection that fear produces. Spiritual bypassing uses mystical language to avoid action. The tradition is describing a state that makes better action possible. The distinction is not subtle. It is everything. The Gospel of Philip. Fear enslaves, love makes free, not sentiment, mechanism. The state of fear is a state of enslavement to the body's survival responses, to the archons who operate through those responses, to the system designed to maintain those responses indefinitely. The state of love, agape, the non-reactive mode, is a state of freedom from those mechanisms. Not freedom from difficulty, not freedom from suffering, freedom from the specific mechanism by which consciousness is kept below the level of pneumatic perception, the apocryphon of John on the pneuma. When the pneuma is recognized in the self, the archon's ability to bind it diminishes, not because a battle is won, because the substrate they require, the fear-identified human being, is no longer fully present. The pneuma, looking at the fear from above it, is not food. What changes when you recognize that you carry the divine spark, not as a religious belief, but as a direct experience? The fear response still arrives. The nervous system still responds to perceived threat. But your relationship to the fear response is different. You are not fully identified with it. An observer position persists through the fear without being extinguished by it. And from that observer position, you have choices that the person fully identified with their fear does not have. You can choose not to watch the fourth catastrophe story in sequence. You can choose to interrupt the scroll. You can choose to notice when your emotional state is being managed by an external system and step outside the management. These seem like small choices. They are not small. They are the precise point where the extraction mechanism succeeds or fails to operate on you. Every tradition in this video has been describing that point. A person who has developed even a partial pneumatic position encounters a breaking news alert. Their body responds, cortisol releases, attention narrows. But the observer in them notices, this is happening. This is the system producing the fear state in me. And from that noticing, from that split second of observation, a choice opens that was not there before. They can follow the alert into the spiral, or they can notice the production of the state and choose their response to it. This choice, invisible to anyone watching from outside, seemingly trivial, is the exact point at which the extraction mechanism succeeds or fails. The Gnostic tradition spent centuries developing practices to make this moment repeatable, teaching the recognition of the production mechanism as the first step toward freedom from it. You cannot exit a system you cannot see. Seeing it is already the beginning. What is the practical meaning of Paul's instruction to meditate on whatever is true, noble, just, pure, lovely, and admirable? In the context of the archontic framework, it is this: The deliberate cultivation of the mental and emotional states associated with coherence, with the heart math definition of cardiac coherence, with the Gnostic definition of pneumatic operation, with the Sufi definition of nafs mutma'inna, is not a passive spiritual exercise. It is an active intervention in the frequency at which your consciousness is operating. Every moment you spend in genuine appreciation, in authentic love, in creative engagement, in deep silence, is a moment in which you are not producing the fear-saturated output that the system requires. It is a moment of non-cooperation with the extraction model. The tradition is not telling you to feel good. It is telling you to operate at the frequency that is structurally inaccessible to the mechanism feeding on you. Not positive thinking, not denial of difficulty, not spiritual bypassing, transmutation. The alchemical language the Hermetic tradition uses for this process is precise. The prima materia of alchemy is not metal. It is the raw human being in the reactive fear-dominated state. The gold is the pneumatic being who processes difficulty without being defined by it. The work of transmutation is not performed by thinking about it. It is performed by consistent practice of the observer position. In the moment of fear, in the moment of anger, in the moment when the news alert arrives and the nervous system responds and the familiar tightening begins. In that moment, the practice, not suppression, not performance of calm, the real observer position, the pneuma looking at the fear from above it. That is the work. That is what every tradition in this video is pointing at. You are watching this video right now. Something brought you to this information at this moment. The tradition we have been examining would say that is not incidental. A person who is entirely content inside the extraction loop does not look for information about the extraction loop. Something in you, the part that felt the weight of the news cycle, the part that noticed the exhaustion after the doom scroll, the part that suspected there was something designed about the sustained state of alarm you were living in, that part found its way here. The tradition calls that part the pneuma, recognizing an opening, not a completion, an opening. What you do with this information in the next 24 hours matters. Not the ideas. The ideas are maps. What matters is whether the map changes where you walk. A person sits at the end of a day and reviews what they gave their attention to. The news cycle. 4 stories, each engineered to produce alarm. Social media. 90 minutes, during which their emotional state was tracked and the content calibrated to maximize engagement, which meant maximizing emotional activation, which meant fear and outrage. 1 piece of horror content chosen as entertainment. Total time spent in elevated cortisol state, approximately 4 hours. Total time spent in coherence, in genuine appreciation, presence, creativity, love, 45 minutes. The extraction ratio of that day is not an accident. It is the outcome of the design of the information environment intersecting with an uninstructed nervous system. The tradition's instruction become the person who knows the design and makes different choices, not every day, more days than yesterday. The way out of the extraction loop that every tradition in this video agrees on is not political. It is not the right social media regulation or the correct platform design policy. Those may help at the margins. The way out is the development of genuine pneumatic consciousness, the recognition of the divine spark within the self, the cultivation of the observer position relative to one's own fear responses, the deliberate and consistent practice of coherence through whatever method the individual's tradition provides. Prayer, meditation, contemplative reading, creative work, service, deep silence. The specific method is secondary. The primary requirement is consistency, the daily return to the practice, even when the news cycle is loudest, even when the fear state is most fully activated. Especially then. The resistance to the extraction mechanism is not performed once, it is practiced continuously. That is what the tradition means when it says, be sober and vigilant. Stop feeding it. The instruction sounds passive. It is not. Choosing not to consume the fourth catastrophe story is an act of consciousness. Choosing to step away from the platform when you notice it is managing your emotional state, is an act of consciousness. Choosing to return to the observer position when the fear response arrives, rather than following the response into the spiral, that is an act of consciousness. These choices are small. They are not trivial. Each one is a moment in which the pneuma asserts itself against the mechanism designed to prevent it from asserting itself. Each one changes the ratio. Each one changes the quality of what is generated in you. Over time, not dramatically, not all at once, but incrementally. The person who makes these choices becomes less food efficient for a system that requires frightened, reactive, unconscious human beings. And more of something the tradition has many names for. The archons, whatever framework you use to understand them, feed on you because they cannot create. The Apocryphon of John calls their nature hysterema, deficiency. They are dependent on what you generate, because they cannot generate it themselves. The thing they cannot access is the thing you were made with, the pneuma, the capacity for gnosis, the capacity for agape, the capacity for creation, for producing something genuinely new in the world that did not exist before you brought it into existence. The moment you operate from that level, you are no longer producing what they require. You are producing something they have no access to. The tradition does not end with this as consolation. It ends with it as instruction. Not be comforted because you are precious. Be aware that you are precious and operate accordingly. The awareness alone is not enough. The awareness that becomes a daily practice, that becomes the way you meet the next news alert, the next scroll, the next moment of manufactured alarm. That is the thing the system was built to prevent you from discovering. If you stayed until the end, write in the comments, I am not alone. I've placed another lesson on your screen right now, your next step on this path. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.